Vivienne Blackwell did not simply reduce the bonus I had spent an entire year earning. In front of the executive board, she slid the envelope back across the table and said that a man who was easily replaceable should not expect to be paid like leadership. I did not argue with her. I closed my laptop, picked up my coat, and walked out of that conference room without raising my voice one single time. But I never reached the elevator button, because a man's voice stopped me in the corridor and said, "Desmond, if she doesn't know what you're worth, I do." The speaker was her greatest rival. If you want to see exactly what a proud chief executive pays for her own arrogance, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end. My name is Desmond Avery, and at 42 years old, I had learned that the quietest man in the building is usually the one holding it up. I arrived at Blackwell Meridian Systems most mornings before 6:30, when the lobby lights were still on their overnight setting, and the security desk was manned by a man named Ray, who liked to talk about his fishing boat. I made my own coffee in the 11th floor kitchen because I had never been assigned an assistant and had stopped asking. My suits were plain, pressed, and inexpensive, chosen because they lasted, not because anyone would recognize the label. I carried a worn leather folder instead of a briefcase. In a company where half the leadership team wore their status like cologne, I had made myself deliberately unremarkable, and for 11 years that had suited me fine. The strange thing about my reputation there was that nobody thought about me when things were going well. Nobody invited me to the celebration dinners, or the golf weekends, or the photographs taken in front of new office signage. But the moment a client started screaming, the moment a contract began sliding toward cancellation, the moment a rollout collapsed into finger pointing between 3 departments, somebody would say my name out loud and a meeting would appear on my calendar within the hour. I was the man they called when the room was already on fire. It was not glamorous work, and it never once made me the story, but it kept the company's largest revenue lines breathing. The clearest example was Atlas Freight, a logistics conglomerate worth close to $90 million in contracted value to us, and a relationship that had nearly died the previous spring. Our implementation had run 4 months behind schedule because of decisions made long before anyone consulted me, and their chief operating officer had already begun quietly interviewing replacement vendors. I flew out to their distribution hub, Val, 11 times in 5 months. I sat in a windowless room with their operations staff and mapped every failure point by hand, including the ones our own engineering group had created and then buried in status reports. I rebuilt the delivery plan, negotiated the credits, and personally called their leadership every Friday afternoon for 22 straight weeks until the trust came back. By the close of the fiscal year, my numbers were not merely acceptable, they were the strongest in my division's history. Revenue against target came in above 130%. Client retention across my portfolio sat at 100%. Margin on the accounts I managed had improved by 9 points. Under the compensation plan issued in January, signed and distributed to every director, those results meant a substantial payout, the kind that changes a household rather than decorating it. I had already run the arithmetic at my kitchen table more than once, and I had already promised myself what the first portion would be spent on. The problem was never the work. The problem was who stood on the stage afterward. When Atlas Freight's leadership sent a formal letter praising the recovery, Vivienne Blackwell read portions of it aloud at an all-hands gathering and never mentioned my name. When I presented the stabilization framework in a client review that March, and their operating chief said plainly that I had saved the account, Vivienne leaned toward the speakerphone with a practiced warmth and corrected the record for everyone present. Desmond, she said, had been extremely helpful. The real strategy, she continued, had come from the leadership team. That single word, helpful, landed in the room like a coin dropped on marble, and every person at that table understood precisely where she had just placed me. There was one other thing she had decided about me, and she was never subtle about it. 3 days a week I left the building at 5:30 because I was raising my daughter Lena alone, and had been since she was 6 years old. I ate dinner with her, asked about her chemistry class, and then opened my laptop again at 9 and worked until midnight, which nobody upstairs ever bothered to verify. Vivienne treated that departure time as a diagnosis. In her vocabulary, it meant I lacked executive thinking, that I was operational rather than strategic, that I was the sort of man who managed tasks while other people carried vision. She said it often enough that other leaders repeated it as though it were an observation instead of an accusation. Then, on a Tuesday in early February, an invitation appeared on my calendar with no agenda attached and no other attendees visible. Annual Compensation Review, Executive Conference Room, Thursday, 2 o'clock. In the 2 weeks before that meeting, the small humiliations began arriving faster, and they stopped feeling accidental. The company prepared a formal case study on the Atlas freight recovery for the board and for external marketing, 41 slides of charts and timelines built almost tirelessly from the framework I had written by hand in a hotel room in Ohio. My name appeared nowhere in it. Instead, a vice president named Corinne Delacroix, who had joined the account 8 weeks before the crisis ended and had attended exactly 2 client calls, was credited as the leader who drove the account recovery. I found out because a project manager sent me the deck by mistake, asking whether the numbers on slide 19 were accurate. They were accurate. I had produced them. The dinner happened the following week, a leadership gathering at a steakhouse downtown to celebrate the fiscal close. I was the one scheduled to present the account overview, and when I arrived, there was no chair for me at the long table. Vivienne looked up, apologized in a tone that contained no apology whatsoever, and suggested I pull something over from the bar. I stood for the first 11 minutes of that dinner holding a folder of my own analysis while 19 people ate. Someone eventually asked, in the friendly way that senior men ask dangerous questions, why Desmond had not been promoted yet given the year he had delivered. Vivienne smiled at that. She set down her glass, tilted her head with the ease of a woman who had never once been told to sit somewhere else, and delivered the line I would remember for years afterward. "Desmond," she said, "is excellent when a room needs cleaning up. That does not mean he should own the building." Several people laughed, some of them uncomfortably, and a few of them looked at their plates. It was designed to sound light. It was designed to be repeatable. And it accomplished exactly what she wanted, which was to define me, permanently and publicly, as maintenance rather than leadership. She was not finished. Someone mentioned my schedule, and Vivienne picked it up like a gift. "Senior leadership," she said, "cannot be watching the clock at 5:30. She said it to a table of executives, most of whom had spouses at home, managing everything she was implying I could not. The bitter part, the part I never bothered to defend, was that I had answered client escalations at 11 at night from my kitchen more times than I could count, and I had once spent the entirety of Lena's spring break on conference calls with an operations team in 3 time zones. Mallory Prescott, our chief people officer, sat 2 seats from Vivienne and smiled through all of it, saying nothing, offering nothing, because her role in that organization was to translate the chief executive's instincts into language that sounded like policy. Driving home that night, I understood something I had been avoiding for a long time. This was not really about a bonus payment, and it had never been about executive presence, or after-hours visibility, or any of the vocabulary Mallory would eventually attach to it. Vivienne Blackwell wanted the labor of an executive from me, permanently and reliably, while withholding the title, the authority, and the money that would have made that labor legitimate. She needed the accounts fixed, and she needed me to remain grateful for the privilege of fixing them. As long as I stayed in that gap, She kept both the results and the credit, and I kept the workload. The next morning, our chief financial officer, a careful man named Peter Lindqvist, who spoke in decimals, forwarded me a preliminary compensation summary because he needed me to verify two account figures. At the bottom of the second page, under projected variable payout for the fiscal year, was a number I read 3 times, $146,000. I walked into the executive conference room that Thursday expecting a negotiation, not a verdict. Vivienne sat at the head of the table with Mallory Prescott on her right, Peter Lindqvist on her left looking like a man who had already lost an argument, and 2 other senior leaders positioned along the side as decoration. There was a coffee service nobody touched. I had prepared for a modest adjustment, because every company trims somewhere, and I had decided in advance that I would accept a reduction of 20 or even 30% without complaint if the reasoning held. Vivienne slid a cream-colored envelope across the polished surface toward me and folded her hands. Inside, on a single sheet of company letterhead, was the figure $7,500. I looked at it for a moment and said there appeared to be an error, that a digit had likely been dropped somewhere in processing. Vivienne said, calmly and without any visible pleasure, that there was no error. She had exercised what the plan document called Chief Executive Discretionary Adjustment, a clause that existed for catastrophic company performance and had never, in 11 years, been applied to a single individual. She had used it to remove 95% of what I had earned. Mallory produced a 1-page memorandum to formalize it, already printed, already dated, already signed. The reasoning was read aloud in that flat corporate register that makes cruelty sound procedural. I had not demonstrated sufficient executive presence throughout the fiscal year. My attendance at evening industry functions and internal leadership events had been inconsistent. My contribution was described as heavily operational rather than reflecting the leadership visibility expected at the director level and above. Not one sentence of it addressed a result. Not one sentence of it disputed a number. I answered the way I had rehearsed on the drive in, without heat. I said my bonus targets, as documented in the January plan and signed by both of us, were built on 3 measurable components, and I named them. Revenue against target, exceeded. Client retention, exceeded. Portfolio margin, exceeded. I said that if the criteria had changed mid-year, I had never been notified, and that I would appreciate seeing the revised document. Vivienne let the silence sit for exactly as long as she wanted it to sit. Then she leaned forward slightly, and she said the sentence that ended whatever loyalty I had left. "You are confusing," she said, "the act of creating value with the authority to determine what your value is." She let that settle, and then she added the part she must have believed was generous. She said I should be grateful to hold stable employment at a company of this caliber, particularly given my family situation, and that stability of that kind was worth more to a man in my position than a single variable payment. She used the phrase, "a man in my position," twice. Peter Lindqvist stared at the table. Mallory nodded as though wisdom had just been dispensed. And because I said nothing at all for the better part of a minute, Vivienne concluded that I had accepted it, which was the first significant miscalculation she made that day. She pushed the envelope another few inches toward me and told me not to turn this into a matter of personal pride. I looked at her, and I asked the only question I had left, which was whether the decision was final. She said, "Completely." I asked whether she wanted me to continue managing the Atlas Freight relationship on the current terms. She said, of course, and something in the way she said it, the automatic assumption inside those 2 words, told me she had never once considered the alternative. So I folded the sheet of letterhead in half, and then in half again, and I put it in my inside pocket. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask for reconsideration or mention my record or invoke a single thing I had done for that company over 11 years. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and thanked everyone at the table sincerely for making the organization's position completely clear to me, because clarity is a genuine gift and I had just been handed a great deal of it. Then I picked up my coat and walked out. Behind me, and I learned this later from Peter, Vivienne watched the door close and turned to Mallory with something close to satisfaction. "He will be back at his desk tomorrow morning," she said. Men like Avery always come back. The corridor outside the executive conference room is 40 feet long and floored in gray stone, and I have walked it perhaps 1,000 times. That afternoon I heard my own footsteps in a way I never had before. I was not angry, which surprised me. What I felt was closer to the strange lightness that arrives when a question you have carried for years finally receives its answer, even when the answer is ugly. 11 years, $90 million in preserved contract value, 100% retention, and a folded piece of paper in my pocket that said 7,500. My phone buzzed against my chest as I reached the elevator bank. It was Lena. "Are you home for dinner tonight?" she had written, with a question mark and nothing else, because 16-year-olds do not waste characters. I typed back a single word, "Yes." Then I put the phone away and raised my hand toward the call button, and that was the exact moment the door of the visitor waiting room across the corridor opened. 3 people came out. The first was a woman in a charcoal suit carrying a litigation bag. The second was a compact man with reading glasses pushed up into his hair, and the third was Grant Holloway. He was 51, silver at the temples, and he had the specific stillness of a man who has never in his adult life needed to hurry to be taken seriously. He ran Holloway Vector Group, which was the single largest competitor Blackwell Meridian Systems had, and he had been in our building that afternoon for a joint standards committee session with 2 other vendors, a meeting so procedural that nobody upstairs had bothered to mention it. He recognized me before I fully registered him. The previous March, Grant Holloway had taken me to a quiet restaurant near the waterfront and spent 90 minutes describing a role he wanted to build around me. He had not flattered me. He had instead recited, from memory and without notes, 3 specific projects I had rescued and the exact structural reason each one had been failing. I had turned him down that night, and I had meant it. Atlas Freight was still in intensive care, and I do not leave a client mid-crisis. I told him that, and instead of pushing, he had simply said that he understood, that he thought better of me for it, and that the door would remain unlocked. Now he looked at me standing in front of an elevator with my coat over my arm, and he looked at the cream-colored envelope still visible in my hand, and something in his face changed by perhaps 2 degrees. He did not ask what had happened. He did not ask about internal matters, and I would learn over the following year that he never did because he considered it both distasteful and unnecessary. He handed his folder to the woman in the charcoal suit, took 1 step closer, and asked a single question. "Does my offer from March still make you uncomfortable?" I said, "Not anymore." What happened next took 11 minutes, and it happened entirely in a hallway. Grant took out his phone, called his chief talent officer, and said 4 sentences. "Pull the Avery file. Update it to current market. I want terms I can put in his hand today." Yes, today. He put the phone on speaker and held it flat on his palm, and I stood there with a man I had met twice while a document that had been sitting dormant in another company's system for 11 months was revised in real time. That was the part that mattered, and I want to be precise about it, because none of this was luck. Holloway Vector had built a file on me a year earlier. They had studied my work through public case filings, client references, and industry conversations. The offer did not appear from nowhere. It had been waiting. The terms came through to his phone, and he turned the screen toward me. Vice President of Enterprise Strategy. Base compensation approximately 35% above what Blackwell Meridian was paying me. Authority to hire and structure my own team of 9. a variable plan tied to 4 published metrics with the calculation formula printed directly in the document, which I had never once seen in writing at my current employer. Full participation in the leadership planning cycle, and at the bottom, a signing bonus of $150,000. I read that last line twice. Grant had no idea what number had been taken from me 40 minutes earlier. He did not know about the envelope, the discretionary clause, or the memorandum Mallory had printed in advance. He had arrived at $150,000 purely from his own valuation of what I was worth on the open market, and it exceeded the entire bonus Vivienne Blackwell had just decided I did not deserve. I have never in my life encountered a coincidence with better timing or worse manners. I read the rest of the terms carefully, because a man does not sign anything he has not read, and what I found was as important as the money. There was no requirement that I bring accounts with me, no clause about client introductions, no expectation of proprietary data, internal documentation, pricing models, or anything else belonging to my current employer. There was, in fact, an explicit restriction prohibiting it, drafted by their own counsel. Grant Holloway was not buying a customer list. He was hiring a person and the way that person thought, which is the only thing in that entire industry that cannot be copied. I looked up and told him I accepted, contingent on a clean and complete resignation process on my end. He extended his hand and said that was the only condition he would have insisted on anyway. The elevator chimed then. The doors slid open on an empty car, and standing at the far end of the corridor, having just stepped out of the executive suite with Mallory Prescott 2 paces behind her, was Vivienne Blackwell. She was looking directly at Grant Holloway, shaking my hand. She understood immediately. Whatever else Vivienne was, she was not slow, and I watched the calculation move across her face in the time it took her to cross 20 feet of gray stone. She arrived with her chin level and asked Grant, in the voice she reserved for people she considered beneath her but too visible to insult openly, what exactly he was doing on her floor. Grant answered without any edge at all, which made it worse. "Hiring someone very good," he said, "whom the market has just informed me was being mispriced." Vivienne said that Desmond Avery was her employee, present tense, under contract, and that whatever conversation had just occurred was premature at best. So I answered her myself. I said that I would submit a formal resignation letter that afternoon, that I would serve whatever transition period my agreement required, and that I would conduct a complete and documented handover of every account in my portfolio. I said it in the same tone I had used for 11 years when telling her a project was on schedule. She laughed. It was short and genuinely amused, and it was the last time I ever saw her look confident. She turned to Grant and said that she found it fascinating that a company of his size would pay executive compensation for a middle manager, and that she assumed his board enjoyed surprises. Grant considered that for a moment with real courtesy. "No," he said, "I am paying executive compensation to a man who has been performing executive work for several years. The only difference between your arrangement and mine is that I intend to put it in writing. I did one more thing before I left that building, and I have thought about it many times since." I walked to the desk outside the chief executive's office, where her assistant Marguerite sat with a look of careful blindness, and I placed the cream-colored envelope on the corner of the desk where it could not be missed. Then I turned back toward Vivienne, who had followed me, and I spoke without any heat whatsoever. "Miss Blackwell just saved $138,500, I said. "Congratulations." Then I took the elevator down. I have been told that the outburst upstairs began roughly 90 seconds later and was audible through 2 closed doors. She instructed Mallory to retrieve my employment agreement and examine the confidentiality provisions, the notice terms, and anything resembling a restrictive covenant. She wanted my access revoked before I reached the parking garage, which was done, and which mattered not at all, since I had already saved nothing that was not mine. By 6 that evening, outside counsel delivered the assessment. My confidentiality obligations were real and permanent, and I had shown every sign of intending to honor them. Beyond that, there was nothing, because Vivienne had personally opposed extending restrictive covenants to the director level 3 years earlier on the grounds that it would raise fixed costs for staff who were, in her words, straightforward to replace. At 9:40 the next morning, Atlas Freight called. It was not the account team who called, and it was not a routine check-in. It was their chief operating officer, and he had one question, delivered before anyone could finish a greeting. Who is replacing Desmond? My first morning at Holloway Vector Group did not begin with a welcome breakfast. It began in Grant's office at 7:15 with his general counsel present and a single page of instructions on the table between us. Do not contact any client of your former employer, including ones you consider personal friends. Do not use, reference, or reconstruct any Blackwell Meridian document, model, or dataset. Do not bring a single file, a single spreadsheet, or a single slide across this threshold. Any inbound contact from one of their accounts is to be logged and routed to counsel the same day. I signed it, and then I asked whether the restriction applied to my own memory of what had gone wrong in that industry over the last decade, because if it did, they had wasted their signing bonus. Grant almost smiled. He said the memory was the entire purchase. He said he had no interest in the contents of my old laptop, that stolen material has a shelf life of about 9 months and a legal tail of about 9 years, and that what he had actually bought was the way I decomposed a failing implementation into its component decisions. He wanted me to build a practice around that, permanently, from scratch, with his budget and his name behind it. In 11 years at Blackwell Meridian, no one had ever described my abilities to my face in a complete sentence. The contrast defined everything that followed. Vivienne had looked at me and seen an instrument, valuable in proportion to how quietly it could be operated and how cheaply it could be maintained. Grant looked at me and saw a person capable of constructing something that would still function after I left the room. Those are not different management styles. They are different beliefs about where value comes from, and one of those beliefs eventually gets audited by reality. Meanwhile, and I want to be clear that I did nothing to cause this, Blackwell Meridian Systems began to come apart at the seams that only I had ever seen. Atlas Freight did not cancel. What Atlas Freight did was worse and far more intelligent. Their renewal, scheduled for automatic extension in the spring, was placed on hold pending internal review, which in that industry is the polite way of saying that a client has begun considering its options for the first time in 6 years. Then the 3 quiet problems surfaced. There had always been 3. The first was a reconciliation gap between their warehouse management data and our routing engine that produced a small daily variance, which I corrected manually every Tuesday and Friday, a task I had inherited by accident and never handed off because there was no process to hand it to. The second was a monthly credit calculation that required a judgment call about weather delays, which I made after a 5-minute phone conversation with their regional supervisor. The third was an escalation path between our engineering group and their night operations that existed nowhere in any document and consisted entirely of 2 men who trusted me. By the 4th week after my departure, the variance had compounded into a $41,000 billing dispute. The credit calculation had been applied by formula, which produced a result that was technically correct and commercially insulting, and the night escalation path simply stopped functioning because nobody knew the number to call. Vivienne's instruction to her leadership team was reported to me in almost identical words by 2 different people. Just do what Avery was doing. Nobody could, and not because I was extraordinary. Nobody could because I had spent 11 years functioning as unpaid connective tissue between 6 departments that Vivienne had never required to speak to one another directly. The knowledge was not hidden. It had simply never been written down, because writing it down would have required acknowledging that a director was performing coordination that belonged to the executive layer. She responded by making me the cause. In a leadership meeting, she said my exit had been unprofessional, timed for maximum damage, and that I had cultivated dependency deliberately in order to make myself difficult to remove. That accusation lasted approximately 4 minutes, because Peter Lindqvist, who had spent a career caring more about accuracy than about comfort, opened a folder and read 3 dates aloud. On each of those dates, I had submitted a formal proposal for a documented succession and cross-training program for the strategic accounts portfolio, with cost estimates and timelines. On each of those dates, the proposal had been declined at the chief executive level as unnecessary overhead. The truth that emerged in that room was more painful than the one Vivienne had constructed. I had not made myself irreplaceable. She had made me irreplaceable by holding me at a level she considered safely low while assigning me responsibilities she never intended to distribute, and then refusing to fund the very process that would have protected the company from exactly this outcome. She had built the dependency in order to keep the price down, and now the invoice had arrived. She did not respond to that the way a leader would. She responded the way a proud person does, which is by trying to make the other party's success illegitimate. It started when Holloway Vector appeared on the qualified vendor list for a large multi-regional logistics program that spring, a program worth substantially more than the Atlas Freight relationship. Within 9 days, 3 separate people in the industry mentioned to me independently that they had heard a version of the same story. Grant Holloway had not hired a strategist. Grant Holloway had purchased a source, an inside man, a way to obtain Blackwell Meridian's pricing architecture and platform roadmap without paying for research. It was never said in writing, and it was never said by Vivienne directly, which is precisely how that kind of thing is always done. Mallory Prescott called me on a Wednesday afternoon. She was warm for the first 90 seconds, the way people are warm when reading from a prepared position, and then she informed me that the company was evaluating potential legal action regarding the circumstances of my departure and my subsequent employment, and that she wanted to give me the courtesy of knowing before counsel made contact. She asked whether I would be willing to have an informal conversation without lawyers to clarify a few things. I told her no politely, and then I told her why I was not afraid. I had a signed and countersigned exit inventory listing every item of company property returned, including 2 laptops, a hardware token, and a badge with the security officer's signature and a timestamp. I had a 14-page handover document I had written on my own time during my notice period, covering all 3 of the informal processes nobody knew about, delivered to 4 named recipients. I had the email in which Vivienne's own office declined my offer to remain available by phone for 30 days at no cost. I had, in short, behaved correctly, and I had documented behaving correctly, because I had learned long ago at that company that doing the right thing without a record is a hobby. Grant went further than I expected. Rather than simply denying it, he commissioned an independent forensic review, paid for by Holloway Vector, examining every device and repository my new team touched, with the report to be provided to any client who asked. It came back clean because it could not come back any other way. He then sent that report, unsolicited, to the procurement office of the multi-regional program. That single act probably won us more credibility than the eventual proposal did. Vivienne, unable to find evidence, escalated in the only direction left. She telephoned a member of Holloway Vector's board of directors, a man she knew socially from a charitable foundation, and expressed concern, delicately, about the reputational exposure of hiring an individual under such circumstances. The board member listened, thanked her, and forwarded a summary of the call to Grant that same evening. Grant did not retaliate. He did not place his own story with anyone, and he did not phone anyone's board. He forwarded the summary to his general counsel with one line, which the counsel later read to me with visible enjoyment. "Please document this, and please advise her counsel that we are documenting it." And while Vivienne was busy trying to damage the reputation of a man who no longer worked for her, Peter Lindquist found something inside her own house. He had been closing out the compensation cycle when he noticed that the bonus matrix governing my payout existed in two versions. The first version, dated and electronically signed the previous January by both Vivienne and Mallory, listed 4 weighted metrics: revenue against target, client retention, portfolio margin, and implementation delivery. I had exceeded all 4. The second version, which carried a modification timestamp 41 days after the fiscal year had closed, had reduced the weighting on 2 of those metrics to almost nothing and introduced a new 50% component titled Executive Visibility and Leadership Contribution, defined nowhere in the document and measurable by no method whatsoever. Somebody had rewritten the rules after the game had ended, and Mallory Prescott's signature was on the amendment. Peter did not take that to Vivienne. He took it to Judith Wainwright, the chair of the board, a 62-year-old woman who had never invited me to lunch, never praised me, and never once in 11 years made a decision based on anything other than documented evidence. She read the 2 versions side by side, and she requested a full compensation audit covering all director-level and above payouts for the past 3 fiscal years. Vivienne treated it as an irritation. In the meeting where she was informed, she said she found it remarkable that the board intended to spend resources litigating $146,000 for a former employee who had already left for a competitor. Judith closed the folder in front of her and answered without raising her voice at all. "No, Vivienne," she said. "This concerns whether a chief executive of this company can change the rules after she has seen who won. In April, Atlas Freight made its decision about the renewal, and it was not the decision anyone at my former company had prepared for. Rather than extending the existing agreement, they announced that the next 5-year platform contract, expanded in scope and value, would go to competitive bid. 4 vendors were invited. Holloway Vector Group was one of them, not because of me, but because we had been pre-qualified on the multi-regional program 2 months earlier. When Grant told me, he asked directly whether I wanted to be involved at all, given the history, and whether I could construct a proposal without touching anything I knew from the inside. I said I could, and then I built it the hard way to prove it. My team worked exclusively from the published request for proposal, Atlas Freight's public filings, their annual sustainability and operations reports, publicly available freight volume data, and 3 formal clarification sessions that every bidding vendor attended together. When one of my analysts asked whether we should just base the throughput assumptions on figures I already knew, I told him to delete the question from his notes and gave him the public datasets instead. It cost us 11 extra days of work. It also meant that every number in our submission could be traced to a source that any auditor could open. What I did use, because no agreement on earth can prevent it, was understanding. I knew that a logistics operator's real fear is not cost. It is the Tuesday morning when 300 trucks are loaded and the routing engine returns nothing. I knew that their night shift supervisors had no confidence in escalation paths that lived in service documents. I knew that the thing they had never once been offered in 6 years was a written, named, contractually binding operational contact structure with response times attached to human beings rather than to departments. So that is what I put on page 4, ahead of the pricing, ahead of the architecture, ahead of everything. The final presentations were held on a Thursday in a conference facility on the 22nd floor of Atlas Freight's headquarters, and the schedule placed Blackwell Meridian first and Holloway Vector immediately after. Vivienne led her own team, which told me she understood the stakes. She brought Corinne Delacroix, the vice president who had been credited with driving my account recovery, along with 2 engineers and a very expensive slide deck. Grant Holloway attended as well, and he sat in the back row and let me lead, which is the most generous thing an executive can do in a room like that. Inside the room, Vivienne opened with confidence and a claim she had been making for months. "Atlas Freight knows," she said, "who has actually provided the platform underneath their operation for the past 6 years. She meant it as an assertion of ownership, and it might have worked in a different room. Atlas Freight's chief operating officer, a plain-spoken man named Warren Kessler who had spent 19 years in distribution before he ever saw a boardroom, set down his pen. "Yes," he said, "which is also why we know exactly who used to show up every time that platform stopped working. We did not win that contract because we were cheapest. We were not cheapest. We came in roughly 4% above Blackwell Meridian on total 5-year cost, and I had refused to discount further because the operational commitments we were making had a real price, and I was not going to sign something my team could not physically deliver. We won because the 90-page operational plan answered the 3 failure categories Atlas Freight had actually lost sleep over, and because every one of those commitments carried a named individual, a response window, and a financial penalty attached to us if we missed it. Blackwell Meridian Systems lost the expansion contract on a Tuesday by letter and lost approximately $112 million of 5-year contracted value in the process. I want to be exact about what did and did not happen here, because this is the part people always get wrong. I did not take that client. I never called Warren Kessler, not once, in the entire period between my resignation and the formal bid process, and every conversation after that was conducted in a room with 3 competing vendors present and a procurement officer taking minutes. Grant Holloway did not buy anyone. He never entertained a single Blackwell Meridian client, and he had turned down the opportunity to hire 2 of my former colleagues specifically to avoid the appearance of it. Vivienne Blackwell lost that account herself, and she lost it in a very particular way. She removed the only person who understood what her largest client was frightened of. She told that client's leadership that the removed person had never mattered, and then she asked them to believe her over their own 6 years of experience. Clients do not follow individuals out of sentiment. They follow competence, and competence had become extremely easy to locate. The compensation audit concluded in May, and it ran to 83 pages. I never asked for it. I was not interviewed for it, and I learned its contents in a phone call from Peter Lindqvist that I took standing in my own kitchen while a pot of water came to a boil. The document trail was complete because Vivienne had never imagined anyone would go looking. My year-end performance evaluation existed in its original form, completed by 2 evaluating managers, rating me as exceeding expectations on every measured objective, with a written recommendation for promotion to vice president attached. 19 days later, after Peter had circulated the preliminary payout figures, there was an instruction from the chief executive's office to revise the evaluation language and the matrix weighting. Mallory Prescott executed both changes and then, on the same afternoon, drafted the memorandum that would be handed to me in a cream-colored envelope 6 weeks later. And then there was the message that made the rest of it unnecessary. Vivienne had written to Mallory, privately, in the plain language people use when they believe they are among their own kind. She wrote that she was not prepared to have a director compensated like an executive, because once a man is paid like an executive, he begins to think he is one. She wrote it in 28 words, and those 28 words dismantled every justification the company had offered me. The motive was now visible in her own handwriting, so to speak. Not performance, because the performance was documented and exceptional. Not fiscal discipline, because the company had posted its strongest year in a decade and had approved 11 other discretionary payments that same cycle without adjustment. The reason was authority. She had decided that paying me correctly would grant me a standing she had no intention of allowing me to hold, and she had been willing to alter signed documents to prevent it. Judith Wainwright convened the board on a Friday morning. The resolution instructed Blackwell Meridian Systems to pay the full documented bonus of $146,000 against the original signed matrix. Vivienne objected on the ground that I was no longer employed there, that the payment served no retention purpose, and that it would establish a dangerous precedent. Judith turned the contract toward her and read the operative clause aloud. The variable compensation had been earned upon achievement of the stated metrics during a period in which I was fully employed. The obligation attached to results already delivered, not to loyalty not yet given. A company, she said, does not pay a bonus for the future. It pays for the year it already banked. The board suspended Vivienne's discretionary compensation authority the same morning, transferring it to a committee chaired by Judith. Then the audit widened, because auditors are incapable of stopping at one file, and it turned out I had not been unique. 2 other payouts had been reduced by discretionary adjustment after the fact, both to employees who had exceeded their targets, and 1 promotion recommendation had been quietly removed from a file entirely. The chief executive, who had spent 9 years telling that board what her judgment was worth, now spent 3 consecutive sessions explaining her documentation. 11 days later, an electronic payment appeared in my account for $146,000, transmitted by a company I no longer worked for, representing money a chief executive had taken from me in order to teach me where I belonged. It arrived while I was sitting in a corner office at her largest competitor, earning 35% more than she had ever paid me. Vivienne called me in June. I let it ring twice before answering, not for drama, but because I genuinely needed a moment to be sure I would be courteous. There was no apology, at least not at first, and not ever in the form of the word itself. She said the company had reflected, that a misunderstanding had developed and been allowed to harden, and that valuable people are sometimes lost to poor internal communication. She said the organization was prepared to correct it comprehensively. Then she made the offer. Senior Vice President of Strategic Accounts. Base compensation 8% above what Holloway Vector was paying me. A guaranteed variable payment, floor and formula in writing. A seat on the operating committee. An office on the executive floor, and I noticed she mentioned the office twice, because to her it was the substance rather than the packaging. Every single item on that list was something she had spent years explaining that I did not possess the presence, the temperament, or the availability to deserve. Then she made her final mistake, which was to explain to me what my own departure had meant. "You have proven your point, Desmond," she said, with the tolerant warmth of someone concluding a negotiation on favorable terms. "Now you can come back." I thought about the corridor, about the chair that was not there at the steakhouse, about the word helpful and the phrase, "a man in my position," and about 11 years of correcting a variance every Tuesday and Friday that nobody had ever asked me how to do. "I did not leave to prove anything to you," I said. "I left because you had already proven everything I needed to know about that place." She was silent for a long moment, and then she asked whether there was any number that would change my answer. I told her there was not, thanked her for the call, and wished her well, and I found to my own surprise that I meant the last part. Then I hung up and went back to reviewing a hiring plan. 9 days later, Blackwell Meridian Systems issued a brief announcement stating that Vivienne Blackwell would be stepping down as chief executive as part of a broader leadership restructuring, effective at the close of the quarter, and thanking her for her years of service. There was no scandal published, no escort from the premises. no photograph of a woman carrying a box. That is not how it happens at that level, and it did not need to. The punishment was precisely proportional and entirely invisible from outside the building. She lost the one thing she had valued above every result the company ever produced, which was the authority to decide what other people were worth. Grant Holloway added me to the Leadership Council in August. After my first full quarter closed at 122% of plan, and he announced it in a room where he described, in detail and without notes, what my team had built. I have a variable plan with a printed formula, 9 people who know I will say their names out loud, and a written succession document for every process I own, because I refuse to build another organization that survives on one man's memory. Lena sent me a message the afternoon the council appointment went out, and it said 4 words. "Proud of you, Dad." That was the entire text, and it was worth more than the wire transfer. In September, I walked back into that same building for an industry conference held in the ground floor auditorium, wearing the same kind of inexpensive pressed suit, this time listed in the program as a speaker representing Holloway Vector Group. The lobby smelled the same. Ray was still at the security desk, and he shook my hand for a long time. My route to the auditorium took me directly past the elevator bank where all of this had ended and started, 40 feet of gray stone and a brushed steel call button, and I noticed that I did not slow down and did not turn my head. There was nothing there I needed to look at. The man that company once described as easily replaceable now spends his working hours being paid by their largest competitor to build the thing Blackwell Meridian Systems is still trying to figure out how to replace. I am that man, and I no longer wonder what I am worth. Vivienne Blackwell cut that bonus because she believed money would remind Desmond Avery of his place. But before he could reach the elevator, the market told them both exactly what he was worth.